On 31st October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1325, formally recognizing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the impact of conflict on women, and the significant role women play in conflict prevention, resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. Since then, 9 further resolutions have been adopted, addressing women's active and effective participation and the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, popularly abbreviated as WPS, is underlined by 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. Today, 32 African countries have adopted national action plans to implement WPS. Welcome to Season 4 of the She Stands for Peace podcast, a series by the United Nations Office to the African Union, supported by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, regular listeners of the podcast will know that past seasons have been a series of interviews with key actors working to achieve WPS in Africa. In this 4th season, we depart from this format. Instead, each episode unpacks various topics aligned with the 4 pillars of WPS, with insights from guests playing critical roles in achieving the agenda. So far in this season, we have focused mostly on participation and partly on prevention, though we mainly discuss prevention in the context of women's participation in preventative measures like early warning systems. In the last episode, we discussed intergenerational dialogue and the participation of young women in peace building. In this episode, we turn our attention to the protection pillar, digging deep into the protection of women peace builders and women's human rights defenders. The threats and risks for women peace builders and women's human rights defenders are wide-ranging, from physical, like torture and rape, to emotional, like secondary trauma, and economic, like losing employment and having the financial access limited. And quite often, these threats have sexual undertones and aim to tarnish their reputation and credibility in their communities. We will share a link in the show notes to the 2020 report by the International Civil Society Action Network, which has a metrics indicating the range of threats and how they impact women peace builders. Chantal Mutamuriza is a feminist human rights defender whose work tackles economic resilience and livelihoods among Burundian refugee women and children in Uganda. She has worked in human rights also in the Gambia, Geneva, and Mali. Following the release of the UN Commission of Inquiry report on human rights abuse in Burundi, she became the target of a sexist online smear campaign. Now, a warning that some listeners may find her story triggering.
Women human rights defenders experience threats, and those who come from countries that are experiencing political unrest or conflict experience even more threats because of that situation. What happened to me in 2017, the background story is that the Human Rights Council set up a commission of inquiry to look into the events that happened in 2015 and later. So the commission of inquiry presented its first report in September 2017 in Geneva. So at that time, obviously, Burundi was against the commission and the report. So they found like a scapegoat. And that scapegoat, it's very easy to find a woman as a scapegoat. And I think that was a good catch because of my background of a women human rights defender who worked with a former president that I did not like. So they said that the Commission of Inquiry was corrupt, especially the president of the Commission of Inquiry. So allegedly had an affair with me, someone that I don't even know. At that time, I wasn't even in Geneva. I was working in Uganda in an NGO that I set up. And then the threats continued on Facebook, on Twitter mainly. I remember one day I woke up with 2,000 tweets about this girl who, the report was written in a hotel. And I think for a woman, the best way to silence a woman or to attack a woman is to attack her sexuality, And to be honest, since that time, when I want to use Twitter, I always have to check what I'm going to write because the same people sometimes, it happened to me to have opinion on issues, but then the same people will retaliate. If we talk about online attack, how do you prevent someone from writing what they want? I think that the protection should be in towards capacity building of women in digital technology to know how they can protect themselves, and also specifically on social media. I think the owners of social media, of Meta, of Twitter, should be able to detect such messages and put in place measures of protection of women. So I think it's really a collective decision that should be taken because those attacks are very subtle and demand a lot of efforts and collaborative efforts from all stakeholders, including private sector. But when it comes to physical protection or rights protection, it is also important to regulate, to adopt policies and laws that regulate the use of social media. And when it comes to physical protection, I think we also need a sensitization towards all spheres of the society to respect women and also consider the attack against women human defenders. I think that the society at large, including private sectors, stakeholders, duty bearers, have to put a lot of effort in recognizing the important work that women human rights defenders do to protect society by protecting them. And this means taking measures and not considering the work of women rights defenders as not important as other human rights defenders. And I think the reason why they get so attacked and threatened is because their work is not enough recognized. And the other thing that need to be recognized is like because of who they are and the gender, their vulnerabilities are exponentially heightened. I think the threats that women human rights defenders go through are the same as men, but used differently because of the gender of women. They can experience sexual violence, they experience sexual harassment, which is not necessarily the same as men.
In previous episodes of She Stands for Peace, we have spoken to numerous women peace builders and women human rights defenders whose stories, like that of Chantal, give us a clear picture of exactly why urgent interventions is needed to ensure their protection. So what does protection look like, and what are the roles of states and international actors?
I think there's a poor understanding of women human rights defenders and women who work in this space.
That's Dr. Fatima Aliku, who is the Executive Director of Neem Foundation. The foundation is a leading crisis response organization that is committed to promoting the protection and well-being of populations and communities affected by conflict, violence and fragility in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin.
It's not been clearly defined as to what our protection needs are and who should provide that protection. We are seen really as people who work in the lower rungs of the security space because a lot of us work in communities and there is not as much emphasis on people who work in the community. And I think there's probably a lot more understanding and maybe protection needs for people who work in the policy spaces because they tend to be in government. I've thought about this issue of protection for women peace builders quite a lot. First of all, in trying to define what exactly is it that we need, who should be the ones who provide it, how can we source these protections? And I still don't have the answers as it relates to Nigeria, because this is not a space that has been widely recognized or even publicly debated. Neem Foundation is a organization that works in conflict, mostly in Nigeria because it was founded in Nigeria, but we work in the Sahel and across Lake Chad. So what we do is we provide services in rehabilitation, reintegration for victims of conflict, but also uniquely to us, also perpetrators of conflict. Because we believe that since there is no real mechanism that engages all perpetrators who come out of conflict, so some of them end up back in communities, and if we don't engage them, it would be difficult to have cohesion in those communities. So we provide these services through a range of programs, including education, but the kind of education we do is education for peace. Well, I think I'd like to see, first of all, a recognition of the vital role that women peacebuilders play in communities in supporting government security architecture and government security infrastructure. They play such a vital role that is unrecognized. And I'd like to see clear policies and guidelines that outline what protection should look like. For example, Neem Foundation, we work in very, very tough, conflict affected areas. And the protection that we get is based on how we negotiate with providers of security on the ground. So, on an individual case by case basis. So, in some states, we have better relationships with security sector and they provide us with basic protection, but it's not common and it's not usual, it's not uniform, and it's not routine.
On 18th of December 2013, the General Assembly adopted a landmark resolution on human rights defenders. And this resolution recognizes the key role they play, particularly the roles and protection of women human rights defenders.
The resolution adopted by the General Assembly in 2013, which aimed to recognize the work of women human rights defenders and their need for protection, is an important resolution which comes at the time where we saw the continuous attack against women human rights defenders and human rights defenders as a whole, but also in particular women human rights defenders working in the conflict-related area. So I would say that this resolution was ahead of time, ahead on time. And as 11 years later, today, we can see that there is an increased hostile environments in which women human rights defenders continue to work. We are seeing emerging of conflicts everywhere. And also, especially, we are also witnesses, unfortunately, a high price that women human rights defenders continue to pay, in particular in conflict area or in country going through instability. While the main focus of the resolution in 2013 was exactly to recognize these challenges and to ask states to adopt the necessary measure at the national level to ensure that those women can enjoy their rights, both to association, to peaceful assembly, to expression, and also to enjoy the necessary protection to do their work. I think there is today, since 2013, let's also recognize that there have been many countries that adopted national protection law for human rights defenders, in particular in West Africa, which also contain, and we saw also recently in DRC, which contain a particular provision for the protection of women human rights defenders. And I think this is a certain things to encourage. And I will also say that 11 years after, there are increased recognition of the challenge, a specific challenge faced by women human rights defenders. If you look at, for example, the recent reports of the Special Rapporteur on the right of human rights defenders, which also highlights the challenges, but also the need for protection of women human rights defenders working in a peace building context. If you look at also my recent report, where I highlight also the importance played by women human rights defenders in peace building, but also the need also to increase the recognition of women-led organizations that are taking care of the victims, also to ensure that they are also part of the peace negotiation, not just being present to be present, but also part of peace negotiation, meaning that they have also their voice can be heard, they can be part of designing agenda for peace, and also that they can also be part of the peace talk itself, not just to say that women are part of the peace building or women human rights, but they have also to define what means post-conflict reconciliation and post-conflict building post-conflict state. And I think also that is also, for me, that's important to do. There is also, as you can see, if we look at the UN resolution on peace, you can also see that there have been less countries that develop really national action plan that take in account women working in civil society or women human rights defenders in particular. So I think today there is a need first to recognize the important work of those women, to ensure also that not only there is just recognition by state making just a speech, but also in national laws there is a specific recognition, but also laws that protect them. But also at the same time also, as I mentioned in my report that I presented to the General Assembly also, there is also resources and funding put at the disposal of those women, in particular those women-led organizations, in order to be able to implement their work. We saw how those women was important. They play important roles during the COVID-19 time by providing rescue to the society when in many cases there was no one to come to save communities from the COVID-19 because everything was closed and we are back out. And also in my recent visit in Brazil, I saw also how those women was important by providing really relief in Favela del Mare, which means that states need to recognize the important role played by the women human rights defenders in development, building democracy, building inclusive society. And I think by doing that and providing the protection, increasing their resources, and making sure that their work is recognized, the state can also increase their protection according, as mentioned in the 2013 resolution. And also, I want also to maybe can highlight one point: women participation in public affairs. It's important also because we need more women representation in order to ensure also that in those decision making, women are so part of decision making, including in post-conflict, because the tendency today is always to keep women as a victim than really asking them to sit on the table to design what should be the transitions of the country to the more inclusive society.
In January 2022, the government of Norway announced it will seed fund the new Women's Peace and Humanitarian funding window for women human rights defenders, aiming to accelerate, and I quote, the effective relief for women that are risking it all and better protect women's participation, as Her Excellency Ms. Anniken Huitfeldt, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, puts it in her opening remarks launching the program.
The Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund was established by the United Nations to really fund local women's organizations on the forefront of crisis. So the way the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund supports the protection is really embedded into the mechanism when it was designed, right? So the idea is that the fund supports local women's organizations with flexible funding and grants that are, can be up to $200,000, but are as small as $5,000. So that is really based on their needs. So it's a fund that is demand-driven. So the first thing that local women's organizations do is that they can embed protection into their grants, right? So when they submit their grants for funding, that will look at preventing conflict or responding to crisis or providing humanitarian response or peace building, within their grant, they would embed and include protection activities. The second way that the fund does that would be through institutional funding grants. So the United Nations Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, as it evolved during the years, has started to provide core funding to local women's organizations. So some of the grants are only for what we call institutional funding. So funding that is meant to be used for the functioning of the organizations, institutional support, protection issues. And what we have seen and noticed across the years is that as women human rights defenders and women peace builders are being more and more targeted, and more of this funding has been used for protection issues, be it as protection for the organization and its premises or safety and its online presence, or be it the protection for individual women who are leading or working on these organizations. And then, because, as I was mentioning, we were seeing more and more targeting of individual women human rights defenders working in conflict areas or women peace builders, what we have done, and that was right after the Taliban took over Kabul in Afghanistan, where, of course, protection of individual women human rights defenders and peace builders, and quite frankly, women in general, had become a huge issue. We thought that it was the time for us to establish a dedicated funding window that would support exclusively the protection and the participation of women human rights defenders in conflict areas. So this window that was established in 2021, based on the Afghanistan example, but is of course used now across the board in the entire world, has supported, I think, is almost 500 women now individually that have accessed, what we call safety nets. So it's really small grants up to $10,000 that are used specifically only exclusively for their protection. So that supports, for example, security. It supports relocation to like third locations within the country or outside the country. It supports also, and maybe we can get back to that, something that is very important, which is mental health. And that we're seeing more and more as being a huge issue for women who are undertaking this type of work in their communities and in their countries, because it's a very isolating work, and they also need to be supported with the mental health and the care, including the self-care, that they need to continue to conduct that work. I think that as we approach 25 years of Security Council Resolution 1325, 30 years of Beijing Declaration, I think we need really a paradigm shift in the way we support the protection of women peace builders and women human rights defenders. And the first reason, of course, is that conflict and crisis are, of course, we know this, are more acute than ever before, but also because more and more we see that women and their organizations are at the heart of the issue. So they must be funded to conduct the work, but they also need to be protected. And I'm saying that the two have to go hand in hand, because we are seeing too much the fact that sometimes women's organizations, we care about protection, which is great, and we need to care about protection, but it cannot be at the cost of participation, right? So it always has to go hand in hand. It's like, okay, this is too dangerous, I'm going to tell you, you have to stop doing it, and that's for your own good. No, and they have the agency of what women's organizations want to do and how they want to do it needs to also remain intact and really preserved as we also work towards the protection of those women, right? So I think the paradigm shift is needed, because obviously we know that women and girls are affected by those countries, right? And we know that women are at the heart of the solutions, because their organizations are really embedded in the communities, they're connected, they know what's going on, they're at the heart of what's going on. And also women's organizations, they work across silos. And I think what we need more and more is to fund initiatives that work across silos, right? Because for too long, we have siloed our response to all of these issues. And now we're seeing that everything is really tied together, like food security, climate change, war, humanitarian response, protection, all of this should be addressed, simultaneously. But one of the things that we're seeing more and more, and is maybe a bit more like newer, is that women and their rights, their voices, sometimes even their bodies, right? They are at the heart of the conflict, and they're used by authoritarian regimes and actors, armed groups, and by everyone as central to their fight sometimes, and to their narrative that fuels the conflict. So we need to finance forces that are working genuinely towards peace, that are solutions-oriented and that are people-centered. And I really think, and I have seen that during my 7 years working with the United Nations Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, how women Sometimes they're the only one talking to each other across borders when no one else would. They provide a humanitarian response that is really based on needs and specific needs, and that is local, that is tailored, that is sustainable. So we're seeing all of this, and we need to really increase the funding that goes to those organizations because they're a force for change. And that's really something that is now evidence-based and that we know, but the funding is still lacking. When it comes to the changes, I think the financial support needs to be, bigger, larger. There's still a huge funding gap, right? But in terms of the quality, it needs, and that's really obvious, it needs more flexibility, There has been shifts in the context that I just described, including how women are weaponized, instrumentalized within now the conflict as part of it, as the narrative. But we are a bit, lagging behind in terms of adapting our support to this new reality. So, for example, we have to be able to shift from financing a project to financing a mandate. We have to be super careful when we finance women's organizations who are working in countries where the authorities are not necessarily they are de facto not really necessarily recognized by the international community, but we still require from these organizations things that are the same as if they were operating in a normal kind of environment, right? So this needs really, really to change. We need more flexible protection mechanism. We need to recognize also women in their diversity. And I think that's also something that there's still some work to do around. We talk about protection of women. There are other identities, in terms of intersectionality that are also important to recognize. What about LGBTQI+? How that kind of being a woman from the LGBTQI+ community plus being a women peacebuilder, how does that also, is an additional risk in terms of protection? How do we address that? And how do we, and I kind of touched upon this a little bit, how do we also center the mental health issue into our response as well? How do we make sure that we support them, that we have a relationship that is based on trust, and that also support the mental health and the self-care while they're doing this work? And of course, that also goes with giving them more credit, more visibility, and that sometimes also, supports their protection. There is an entire new world about supporting the protection, the online activity of women peacebuilders and humanitarian defenders. And just to close on this, I just wanted to reiterate that we really need to make sure that protection and participation stay hand in hand. We need to support their protection, but we really need to continue to also make sure that they respond to the crisis in the way that is demand-driven, that really is aligned with their needs as they identify them in the communities.
That's it for this episode of She Stands for Peace. Until next time, stand for peace with Africa's Women, Peace and Security agenda.